What if I told you that before the flood that drowned the world, the earth was populated by beings so massive, so violent, and so alien to human nature that the creator of the universe decided the only solution was total annihilation? What if these weren't metaphors or myths, but memories? Fragments of something real that ancient peoples witnessed, feared, and desperately tried to forget. Here's the paradox that should keep you awake at night. Nearly every culture on Earth has stories of giants. The Greeks had their titans. The Norse spoke of the Jötnar. Native American traditions describe towering beings who shaped mountains. Mesopotamian kings boasted of defeating giant kings who came before them. And yet, when we look for physical evidence, we find scattered bones that turn out to be mammoths, misidentified femurs, deliberate hoaxes, and an archaeological record that seems to have been scrubbed clean. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. And in the case of the Nephilim, we're not dealing with a fringe theory or a modern conspiracy. We're dealing with one of the oldest, most persistent, and most terrifying stories ever told. One that appears in the canonical Bible, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in early Jewish mysticism, and in the foundational texts of Christianity and Islam. A story so disturbing that later, religious authorities tried to bury it, sanitize it, and explain it away. Picture this: the world before the flood. Human civilization is young, fragile, still learning to farm and build. And then they come. Beings that tower 3, 4, 5 times the height of a normal human. They are not fully human, not fully divine, something in between, something wrong. At first, they are marvels. They teach humanity secrets that angels were never meant to share: metallurgy, warfare, cosmetics, astrology, the secrets of plants and poisons. But their appetites grow. They devour the harvests meant to feed entire villages in a single meal. When the food runs out, they turn to animals. And when the animals are gone, they turn to each other and then to us. The earth becomes a slaughterhouse. Blood soaks into the soil so deep that the ground itself cries out to heaven. And heaven, for the first time in creation, decides that the only cure is to drown everything and start over. Today, we're going to descend into one of the oldest mysteries in human history. We're going to explore who the Nephilim were, or what they represented. We're going to trace their origins from a handful of cryptic verses in Genesis to the elaborate demonology of medieval Christianity. We're going to ask whether they were literal giants or symbolic representations of corruption, whether they died in the flood or survived to haunt later generations, and why their story appears in different forms across virtually every ancient culture. And we're going to ask the most unsettling question of all: if the Nephilim represent power without restraint, appetite without limit, and knowledge without wisdom, are they really extinct? Or are they walking among us today, just wearing different faces? This is the story of the giants before the flood. This is the story of the Nephilim. The entire nightmare begins with 6 verses. 6 verses in Genesis chapter 6 that have caused more theological headaches, more interpretive gymnastics, and more apocalyptic speculation than perhaps any other passage in the Hebrew Bible. And the reason is simple. These verses describe something that shouldn't be possible, something that breaks the fundamental rules of heaven and earth. Here's what the text actually says, and I'm paraphrasing from the Hebrew. When human beings began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown." Read those lines again. The sons of God, in Hebrew, B'nai Elohim, descended from wherever divine beings dwell and interbred with human women. The offspring of these unions were called Nephilim, and they were the Giborim, the mighty ones, the men of renown. And then, almost as an afterthought, Genesis tells us that these were the days when the earth was corrupt in God's sight and full of violence. 5 verses later, God announces his decision to wipe out everything that breathes. Now, if you're a modern reader trained in rationalist thinking, your brain is already scrambling for explanations. Maybe sons of God means the descendants of Seth, the righteous line, and daughters of humans means the descendants of Cain, the corrupt line. Maybe this is just ancient Hebrew poetry, describing the mixing of social classes. Maybe Nephilim just means mighty warriors, and the whole thing is about tribal conflicts getting out of hand. These interpretations exist, and we'll explore them. But here's what you need to understand. For the first 2,000 years of Jewish and Christian tradition, almost nobody read it that way. The ancient readers knew exactly what the text was describing because they had the full story, and that story was preserved in the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is not in your Bible, unless you happen to be Ethiopian Orthodox. But for early church fathers, for the Dead Sea Scrolls community, for Second Temple Jewish scholars, Enoch was scripture. The New Testament quoted it. Early Christians revered it. Then slowly, it was suppressed. Too dangerous, too weird, too cosmologically problematic. But it survived in Ethiopic, rediscovered when fragments appeared among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what Enoch describes is not metaphor. It's invasion. According to Enoch, in the days when humanity was still young, 200 angels descended to Mount Hermon. They were called the Watchers, the Gregorian Greek, beings assigned by God to observe humanity, but never to interfere. Their leader was Shemihaza, though some texts name him Samyaza or Azazel. These angels looked down from heaven and saw the daughters of men, and they didn't just see beauty, they saw desire, possibility, forbidden fruit. And Shemihaza gathered the others and made them swear an oath, binding themselves together in mutual damnation, because he knew what they were about to do was cosmic treason. The oath was this: they would descend together, take human wives together, and share the guilt together so that no single angel could betray the others. It was a pact of mutual destruction. They descended to Mount Hermon. The name itself means devoted to destruction or place of the curse. And they took human wives. Not just wives, but hundreds of them. And their wives conceived and gave birth to children who were not fully human and not fully angel, but something else. something the universe had never seen before. These children were the Nephilim, and according to Enoch, they grew. They grew to enormous size. Some traditions say 10 feet, others say 30. Some say they literally scraped the sky. But size was just the beginning of the problem. These beings had appetites that no earthly ecosystem could sustain. A single Nephilim could consume the food stores meant for an entire village. They hunted animals to extinction in their territories. And when there was no food left, when the earth literally could not produce enough to satisfy them, they turned to cannibalism. They ate each other. They ate humans. The Book of Enoch describes them devouring flesh and drinking blood, turning the earth into an abattoir. But the corruption went deeper than violence. The Watchers who had descended brought with them forbidden knowledge, the kind of knowledge that angels were never meant to teach. Azazel, one of the leaders, taught humans metallurgy and weapon making, turning tribal conflicts into industrial warfare. He taught women cosmetics and ornamentation, which the text frames as deception and vanity. Another angel, Barakijal, taught astrology. Kokabel taught the omens and portents. Amazarak taught sorcery and root cutting, essentially pharmacology and poison making. Shemihaza himself taught spells and the cutting of roots. Do you see what's happening here? This isn't just a story about sexual transgression. This is a story about knowledge without wisdom, technology without ethics, power without restraint. The Watchers gave humanity the tools of civilization centuries before we were ready for them. And their children, the Nephilim, embody this corruption in physical form, too powerful to control, too hungry to satisfy, too violent to coexist with normal humanity. The earth, according to Enoch, began to cry out. Not metaphorically, the text suggests that creation itself was groaning under the weight of this violation. The blood of innocence soaked into the soil. The natural order was collapsing. And 4 archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, went before the throne of God and reported what was happening. They told him that the world was dying, that Azazel had corrupted everything, that the Nephilim were consuming creation faster than it could regenerate. And God, for the first time since creating the universe, decided that his creation was unfixable. The corruption was too deep. The stain was genetic. The only solution was to drown it all and start over with the one righteous family left, Noah and his kin, who had not mixed with the Watchers or their offspring. But before the flood, God pronounced judgment on the Watchers themselves. They would be bound in chains of darkness, imprisoned in pits beneath the earth, held there until the final judgment when they would be thrown into the lake of fire. Azazel specifically would be imprisoned in the desert of Dudael, bound hand and foot, buried under jagged rocks, to remain in darkness until the end of days. And the Nephilim, their fate was perhaps even stranger. According to Enoch, when the Nephilim died, whether in the flood or by violence before it, their spirits didn't go to Sheol like human souls. They became demons, the evil spirits that plague humanity, the malevolent forces that tempt and torment and possess. These, according to early Jewish demonology, are the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. forever wandering the earth, forever hungry, forever trying to reclaim the physical existence that was ripped from them. This is the story the ancient world believed. Not a story about metaphorical corruption, not a tale about social mixing or tribal warfare. A story about cosmic rebellion, genetic contamination, and the near total destruction of creation. And what makes it deeply unsettling is not just the violence or the theological implications. It's the question of whether any of it actually happened. Let's sit with the horror for a moment, because I think modern readers, safely separated from the ancient world by thousands of years and layers of rationalist interpretation, don't quite grasp how apocalyptic this narrative was for the people who told it. Imagine you're a farmer in ancient Judea, hearing this story for the first time. Your world is small. Your village is maybe 100 people. Food security is everything. One bad harvest means starvation. Your survival depends on a delicate balance between human population, agricultural output, and the carrying capacity of the land. And now, someone tells you that once, before the memory of your oldest ancestors, there were beings who could eat in one day what your entire village produces in a month. Beings whose very existence was a violation of natural law. Beings who, when they ran out of grain and livestock, turned to eating people. The Book of Enoch doesn't shy away from the details. It describes the Nephilim as consuming the labors of all the sons of men, and men were unable to sustain them. Think about that phrase. Unable to sustain them. Human agriculture, human civilization, the entire economy of food production was insufficient to feed these beings. They were apex predators Earth's ecosystem had never designed for and could never accommodate. So they adapted. First came wild animals, hunted to local extinction. Then they turned to each other. Enoch describes them beginning to devour one another's flesh, suggesting both cannibalism among giants and predation on humans. The phrase is stark. They began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. This is where the story pivots from cosmic melodrama to genuine horror, because what Enoch is describing is the collapse of civilization under the weight of unsustainable apex predators. It's ecological catastrophe. It's the food chain inverted. Humans went from being masters of their environment to prey animals cowering before beings they couldn't fight, couldn't appease, and couldn't escape. But remember, the Nephilim weren't just physically destructive. Their fathers, the Watchers, had taught humanity knowledge we weren't meant to have. Azazel stands out as the primary corrupter. The Book of Enoch spends significant time detailing his crimes. Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates. He has revealed eternal secrets, which were preserved in heaven. Before Azazel, conflicts were fought with sticks and stones. After Azazel, humans could slaughter each other with industrial efficiency. He also taught what the text calls the art of making up the eyes and beautifying the eyelids, along with precious stones and dyes. Now, modern readers might think, what's wrong with makeup and jewelry? But the ancient perspective was different. This knowledge was seen as deception, the art of appearing to be something you're not, of manipulating perception, of creating false value. It was the beginning of vanity, inequality, and social hierarchy based on ornamentation rather than virtue. Other watchers taught other secrets. Astronomy became astrology, which became divination and fortune-telling. Botany became poison-making. Observation of nature became weather magic and cloud reading. Every gift of knowledge from the watchers came with a shadow side, a way to use it for control, domination, or destruction. And the Nephilim, as the living embodiments of this forbidden knowledge, represented its ultimate expression: power without wisdom, strength without restraint, desire without limit. The text says that the earth made accusation against the lawless ones. Read that again. Not humans made accusation. The earth itself. This suggests that the corruption had become environmental, geological, cosmic. The blood of the innocent had literally soaked into the ground, and creation itself was crying out for justice. In some passages, Enoch describes the earth as groaning, as if the planet itself was in pain under the weight of this violation. And here's where we need to pause and ask, what does this story actually mean? Is it a memory of something real? A prehistoric encounter with a rival species? Perhaps Neanderthals or Denisovans, recalled through the distorting lens of mythology? Is it an allegory for the corruption that comes when powerful leaders abuse their authority and treat their subjects as prey? Is it a metaphor for technology outpacing ethics? For civilizations that gained power before they gained wisdom? The ancient audience didn't see these as mutually exclusive options. They could hold multiple interpretations simultaneously. Yes, the Nephilim were literal giants who physically terrorized the earth. And yes, they also represented every king who devoured his people, every tyrant who treated human lives as disposable, every civilization that grew too proud, too powerful, too confident in its own supremacy. The story worked on multiple levels because truth works on multiple levels. What we do know is this. By the time we reach Genesis chapter 6, verse 11, the verdict is in. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. The Hebrew word for violence here is Hamas, not the modern political organization, but an ancient word meaning brutal violence, ruthless cruelty, violence for its own sake. The earth had become a place where might made right, where the strong devoured the weak, where no one was safe and nothing was sacred. And so the divine council convened. The archangels testified, the earth accused, and God made a decision that would echo through every flood myth in human history. The world needed to be purged, drowned, reset to factory settings. Everything that breathed air would die. The only survivors would be Noah, his family, and breeding pairs of animals who had not been corrupted by the Nephilim's influence. But here's the question that haunts this entire narrative. Did the strategy work? If the Nephilim were the product of angel-human breeding, and if all the Nephilim died in the flood, why do they appear again after the flood? Why does Moses send spies into Canaan, and they come back terrified, reporting that we saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim? Why do the Israelites encounter giants, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim, centuries after the flood supposedly wiped them out? Either some Nephilim survived, or the Watchers came back for round 2, or the word Nephilim started to mean something broader than the original hybrid offspring. Or, and this is the interpretation that most troubles traditional theology, the whole point was never eradicating a specific genetic line, but dealing with a recurring pattern of corruption, a cycle of power and violence that keeps regenerating no matter how many times you try to drown it. Here's where the story gets stranger and more interesting. Because the Nephilim narrative isn't unique to Hebrew tradition. Strip away the specific names and theological framing, and you find the same story, almost the same story, echoing across ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern cultures. The details change, the gods have different names, but the core plot remains eerily consistent. Divine beings descend, they corrupt humanity, they or their offspring become too powerful, and the gods respond with catastrophic destruction. Start with Mesopotamia, the civilization that gave us writing, law codes, and the earliest versions of the flood narrative. The Sumerians and Akkadians spoke of the Apkallu, 7 divine sages who descended before the flood to teach humanity the arts of civilization. They brought writing, mathematics, agriculture, and temple building. Sound familiar? Like the Watchers, they were divine beings who taught forbidden or premature knowledge. And like the Watchers, their intervention was associated with corruption that led to divine judgment. But there's a crucial difference. In most Mesopotamian traditions, the Apkallu were sent by the gods as a gift, not as rebels. They were supposed to teach humanity. The problem wasn't the knowledge itself, but what humans did with it. Or in some versions, how the gods came to regret giving humans so much power so quickly. This offers a different moral framework. Perhaps the issue wasn't rebellious angels, but premature enlightenment, technology without the wisdom to use it responsibly. Some Mesopotamian texts also describe the pre-flood world as populated by hybrid beings, part human and part divine. The kings of the antediluvian period were said to have reigned for thousands of years. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years, Alalangar for 36,000 years. These aren't human lifespans. They're mythic, superhuman, perhaps even describing beings like the Nephilim, who lived far longer than ordinary humans. And when the flood came, it wiped out this race of semi-divine monarchs, leaving only fully human kings to rule in the aftermath. Now pivot to Greece. The Titans, children of Uranus and Gaia, represent the first generation of divine beings who ruled before the Olympians. They were massive, primordial, more force than personality. They were overthrown in the catastrophic Titanomachy, where Zeus and his siblings defeated Kronos and the older generation, casting them into Tartarus, a prison of darkness beneath the earth. Divine beings from an earlier age, overthrown by younger gods, imprisoned in darkness. Sound familiar? The Greeks also had the Gigantomachy, the war between Olympians and giants, a separate race of enormous beings born from Gaia's blood who tried to storm Mount Olympus. They were defeated and buried under mountains and volcanoes. Again, giants connected to divine origins who rebel against heaven and are catastrophically imprisoned. Then there's the Greek hero tradition. Hercules, Achilles, Perseus. These were demigods, offspring of gods and mortal women. They were explicitly described as stronger, taller, more beautiful, and more violent than ordinary humans. They were heroes of old, men of renown, which is exactly how Genesis describes the Nephilim. The main difference is that Greek culture celebrated these figures as founders of dynasties and civilization bringers, while Hebrew tradition saw similar beings as corruption that needed to be purged. Norse mythology has the Jötnar, usually translated as giants, but more accurately, devourers. They're primordial beings who predate the gods and represent chaos, winter, and destruction. The gods are in constant conflict with them, and Ragnarok, the Norse apocalypse, is essentially a final war between gods and giants that ends with the world burning and flooding, then being reborn. There's your cycle again. Ancient, powerful beings, cosmic conflict, apocalyptic destruction, and reset. In Native American traditions across multiple tribes, there are stories of giant beings who once walked the earth. The tall ones, the Saiteka, various tribal names for beings who were larger and more powerful than humans. Many of these stories end with the giants being destroyed, often through natural catastrophe or by the intervention of divine beings who decide the giants have become too dangerous. Here's what's fascinating. These parallels are so strong that scholars have spent centuries trying to figure out what they mean. Are these independent mythologies that convergently arrived at similar archetypes? That's possible. The human mind might naturally create stories about giant precursor beings as a way to explain megalithic ruins or dinosaur fossils. It's also possible that these stories represent cultural memories of actual encounters with other hominid species. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo heidelbergensis, who were indeed taller and more robust than Homo sapiens, and who we know interbred with our ancestors before going extinct. Or, and this is the interpretation that ancient peoples themselves would have preferred, maybe all these stories are preserving fragments of a real event, a prehistoric catastrophe so traumatic that every culture that survived it incorporated the memory into their foundational myths. The details drifted, the theology adapted to local pantheons, but the core remained. There were giants. They were connected to the divine. They became corrupt or dangerous, and they were destroyed in a catastrophe that reset human civilization. What makes the Nephilim version unique is its theological sophistication. The Greek myths celebrate demigods. The Hebrew tradition condemns them. The Mesopotamian texts see pre-flood knowledge as a divine gift. The Book of Enoch sees it as theft and corruption. The Genesis narrative explicitly frames the giant-producing unions as transgressive, as a violation of cosmic boundaries that couldn't be tolerated. But here's what all these traditions agree on. There was a before, and there is an after. Before the flood, before the catastrophe, before the reset, there was something else, something older, larger, more powerful, and more dangerous. And whatever it was, it didn't survive. Or if it did, it survived only in fragments, in diminished form, in the rumors and terror that ancient peoples felt when they encountered ruins they couldn't explain or enemies they couldn't defeat. The Nephilim in this reading aren't just a Hebrew peculiarity. They're humanity's collective memory of a prehistoric other, whether literal giants, rival hominids, or the metaphorical giants of early civilizations that collapsed so thoroughly they were forgotten. And the fact that this memory persists across continents and cultures suggests that whatever happened, it was profound enough to scar the collective human psyche permanently. So the rain came. According to Genesis, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. Water from below, water from above. And for 40 days and 40 nights, the world drowned. Every living thing that breathed air died, man, beast, bird, reptile, and presumably the Nephilim. Only Noah's family and the animals in the ark survived. The earth was purged. The corruption was washed away. Creation got its factory reset. Except that's not where the story ends. Because if you keep reading the Hebrew Bible, the Nephilim keep showing up. When Moses sends 12 spies into Canaan to scout the promised land, 10 of them come back terrified. Their report in Numbers chapter 13 is pure panic. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. The scouts saw giants so large that they felt like insects in comparison. These weren't just tall people. The language suggests beings of genuinely monstrous proportions that triggered existential terror. The text specifically identifies them as Anakim, descendants of Anak, and then explicitly calls them Nephilim. If the Nephilim all died in the flood, how are there Nephilim in Canaan centuries later? The traditional explanation is that somehow, some line of giant survived, either because some Nephilim were on high mountains that the floodwaters didn't quite cover, or because the Watchers descended again after the flood and produced a second generation, or because the Nephilim bloodline survived through Noah's family itself. That last option is particularly troubling theologically, because it suggests the ark carried the very corruption it was meant to escape. But the text doesn't explain. It just presents us with post-flood giants as a fact. And not just the Anakim. The Bible mentions multiple giant races: the Rephaim, described as an ancient race of giants who once inhabited the lands east of the Jordan; the Emim, who lived in what would become Moab; the Zamzummim in Ammon; King Og of Bashan, whose bed was made of iron and measured 9 cubits by 4 cubits, roughly 13 feet by 6 feet. If that's the size of his bed, how large was Og himself? The most famous post-flood giant is, of course, Goliath of Gath, who stood 6 cubits and a span, somewhere between 9 and 10 feet tall depending on which cubit measurement you use. He was killed by David in one of the Bible's most iconic underdog stories. But Goliath wasn't unique. 2 Samuel lists several other giants killed by David's mighty men, including Ishbi-Benob, Saph, and a man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. The polydactyly is interesting because it appears multiple times in descriptions of giants, suggesting either a genetic marker of the Nephilim bloodline or a legendary embellishment to make giants seem even more monstrous and inhuman. So what do we make of this? If the flood was supposed to wipe out the Nephilim, why do they keep appearing? There are several possible explanations, and they're not mutually exclusive. First possibility, the word Nephilim changed meaning. In Genesis 6, it might have specifically meant the hybrid offspring of Watchers and humans. But by the time of Numbers, it might have become a general term for any unusually large or powerful people group. Just as we use giant today to describe anyone very tall, not literal mythological titans, maybe Nephilim became a descriptor rather than a specific lineage. Second possibility, the giants of Canaan were not descendants of the original Nephilim, but a separate population, either natural humans, who were simply very tall due to genetics, or the result of a second angelic incursion after the flood. The latter is supported by passages in Enoch that suggest the watchers were bound but not destroyed, implying the possibility of escape or renewed rebellion. Third possibility, the survival of giants is meant to teach a theological lesson. The flood didn't eradicate evil. It only reset the playing field. Corruption, violence, pride, and rebellion keep recurring because they're inherent to free will, not just genetic contamination. The post-flood giants represent the eternal recurrence of the same pattern. Power unchecked becomes tyranny. Might makes right, and someone always rises up who thinks they can storm heaven. There's also a fourth, more unsettling interpretation suggested by some early Jewish sources. Noah's lineage wasn't pure. Ham, Noah's son, might have married a woman from a Nephilim bloodline, or Canaan. Ham's son might have been the result of a union with a giant or demon. This would explain why Canaan was cursed, and why the Canaanites later became associated with giant races. It's a troubling reading because it suggests the ark carried the seed of corruption within it, that total purification was never actually achieved. What we do know is that by the time Israel enters Canaan, the promised land is populated by giants, and God commands their extermination. The wars of conquest aren't just about real estate. They're framed as finishing the work of the flood. The Anakim, the Rephaim, the remnants of the giant races, they all need to be wiped out because they represent the continuation of pre-flood corruption. And yet, they're never fully destroyed. Even after the conquest, giants keep appearing. Even after David kills Goliath, his men are still fighting giants in the Philistine territories. It's as if the giant problem is fundamentally unsolvable. You can defeat individual giants, you can kill their champions, you can conquer their cities, but the archetype keeps regenerating. There's always another Goliath, another Og, another Anak. The giants keep coming back because perhaps they were never really about genetics in the first place. They were about power, about violence, about the eternal temptation to become more than human, to storm heaven, to remake the world in your own image, regardless of who you have to devour to do it. And that brings us to the question of what happened to the Nephilim when they died. According to the Book of Enoch, the spirits of the slain giants didn't go to Sheol like human souls. They became demons, evil spirits that roam the earth, afflicting, oppressing, destroying, attacking, doing battle, and causing destruction on the earth. They're not dead. They're disembodied. They can't physically dominate anymore. So they possess, they tempt, they corrupt from within. Every demon in Jewish and Christian demonology is, according to this tradition, the ghost of a Nephilim, still trying to reclaim the physical existence that was torn from them. This is why exorcisms in the New Testament involve casting out spirits that give their victims supernatural strength. Why demons recognize Jesus as the Son of God and plead not to be cast into the abyss. They remember the divine realm they once had access to through their watcher fathers. They remember what it was like to have bodies, to have power, to walk the earth as giants. And they've spent every generation since trying to reclaim it. So did the Nephilim die in the flood? Yes and no. Their bodies died. Their genes might have been eliminated, or might have survived in diluted form. But their spirits remained, their influence persisted, and most importantly, their archetype endured. The giants never really left. They just learned to wear different masks. But what happens when a story becomes too strange for theology to handle? When sacred texts describe something too mythological, too pre-scientific, too cosmically unsettling to defend in an age of reason? Let's talk about what happened when later generations tried to make sense of all this. The story of the Nephilim is also a story about how uncomfortable religious authorities get when confronted with narratives that resist domestication. In the Second Temple period, roughly 500 BCE to 70 CE, the Nephilim narrative was taken literally and seriously. The Book of Enoch was regarded as scripture. The Dead Sea Scrolls community at Qumran had multiple copies of Enoch and fragments of other texts elaborating on the Watchers and their offspring. Early Jewish writers like Philo and Josephus accepted the basic story. Angels descended, interbred with humans, produced giants, and were punished for it. The New Testament even references this tradition. The Epistle of Jude quotes directly from the Book of Enoch, and 2 Peter mentions the angels who sinned being cast into Tartarus, the Greek name for the dark prison where the Titans were held, which early Christians identified with the prison of the Watchers. But as Judaism solidified after the destruction of the Second Temple, and as Christianity became institutionalized, the Nephilim narrative started to create problems. The biggest problem was theological. Can angels even have sexual desire? Do they have bodies capable of biological reproduction? If angels are spirits, how could they breed with humans? And if they could, doesn't that suggest a fundamental instability in God's creation, that divine beings can rebel and corrupt in ways that God apparently didn't foresee or prevent? So the rabbis and church fathers started developing alternative interpretations. One of the most popular was the Sethite theory. Sons of God doesn't mean angels. It means the descendants of Seth, the righteous line of Adam. Daughters of men means the descendants of Cain, the cursed line. The sin wasn't angelic rebellion, but the mixing of the godly and ungodly lines. The Nephilim weren't hybrids. They were just the violent offspring of mixed marriages. This interpretation strips all the mythological strangeness out of the text and turns it into a moral lesson about not marrying outside your faith community. The problem with the Sethite theory is that it doesn't fit the text. The phrase sons of God in Hebrew is B'nai Elohim. Everywhere else in the Hebrew Bible, it refers to divine beings, not human lineages. The Book of Job uses it explicitly for angels in the divine council. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation used by early Christians, translates it as angels. And the Sethite reading doesn't explain why this particular sin required global genocide. People marry outside their tribe constantly. It doesn't usually provoke divine decisions to drown the planet. But the Sethite interpretation persisted because it was safe, respectable, and didn't require you to believe in angel-human hybrids. Augustine endorsed it. Most medieval theologians taught it. It became the standard orthodox position, and the Book of Enoch was quietly sidelined, eventually disappearing from Western Christianity entirely. Meanwhile, Jewish mystical tradition went the opposite direction. The Kabbalists embraced the Nephilim narrative as a fundamental part of their cosmology. The Zohar and other mystical texts elaborated on the Watchers, described multiple angelic rebellions, and developed complex theories about how angelic essence could mix with material reality. The Nephilim became part of a larger framework about the Sitra Achra, the other side, the realm of demonic power that opposes divine holiness. Islamic tradition split the difference. The Quran doesn't mention the Nephilim by name, but it does describe Iblis and his followers as jinn, who rebelled against God. And it mentions that some jinn take human form and intermarry with humans. Medieval Islamic scholars debated whether the sons of God in the corrupted Israelite texts were angels, jinn, or just powerful human tyrants. Most leaned towards the interpretation that they were either jinn or human kings who claimed divine status, preserving the general shape of the narrative while avoiding the thorny question of angel reproduction. In modern times, we've added new layers of interpretation. The rationalist reading says the Nephilim story is just mythology. Ancient people trying to explain megalithic ruins, dinosaur fossils, or the existence of unusually tall neighboring tribes. The psychological reading says giants represent our fear of those more powerful than us, childhood terror of adults, social anxiety about authorities and tyrants, the nightmare of being prey instead of predator. The allegorical reading says the Nephilim represent any civilization or ideology that grows too proud, too powerful, too confident that it can remake reality according to its own will. And then there are the modern literalists, creationists, and ancient alien theorists who think the Nephilim were real, physical giants, and that evidence has been suppressed. YouTube is full of videos about giant bones that turned out to be hoaxes, mammoth remains, or photo manipulation. There's a certain desperation in these searches, as if physical proof of giants would somehow validate the entire biblical narrative or reveal suppressed ancient history. But here's what I think is most interesting. Every interpretation, from the ancient rabbis to modern skeptics, agrees that the Nephilim story is about boundaries being violated. Whether you read it as angels breeding with humans, godly lines mixing with ungodly ones, humans claiming divine status, or civilizations growing too powerful, the core is always the same. Something crossed a line, something mixed that wasn't supposed to mix. Something tried to be more than it was created to be. And the result was corruption so deep that it nearly destroyed everything. The interpretation wars aren't really about whether giants were 8 feet tall or 80. They're about what happens when power encounters no resistance, when appetite acknowledges no limit, when beings, human or otherwise, decide that they're not bound by the rules that govern everyone else. The Nephilim are terrifying not because they're big, but because they represent power that recognizes no constraint, knowledge without wisdom, strength without ethics, desire without restraint. And that interpretation holds whether you believe in literal angel-human hybrids or see the whole thing as mythology. Because we've seen it play out in history. We've seen empires that devoured their subjects until there was nothing left to devour. We've seen technologies developed without thought for consequences. We've seen ideologies that promise to remake humanity into something better, but instead produced mountains of corpses. The Nephilim aren't extinct because the Nephilim were never really about genetics. They were about hubris. They were about power without accountability. They were about what happens when someone decides they don't just want to live in the world. They want to own it, dominate it, consume it, remake it in their own image. And that impulse didn't drown in the flood. It's still here. It's always been here. Which brings us to the most important question. Where are the Nephilim today? Let me tell you about the giants walking among us right now. And they don't need to be 10 feet tall to devour the world. There are corporations whose annual revenue exceeds the GDP of most nations. They extract resources faster than ecosystems can regenerate. They shape laws to serve their appetites. They consume smaller competitors like the Nephilim consumed villages. They're giants. They're too big to fail, too big to regulate, too big to stop. When they stumble, entire economies convulse. When they fall, governments rush to resurrect them because the alternative is unthinkable. Their appetite for growth is insatiable. Every quarter must exceed the last. Every market must be conquered. Every competitor must be absorbed or destroyed. And when there's nothing left to consume externally, they turn on themselves, cannibalizing their own workforce, hollowing out communities, extracting value until there's nothing but profit and ruin. There are technologies that promise to elevate humanity, but instead risk enslaving us. Artificial intelligence systems trained on the entire corpus of human knowledge, learning patterns we don't understand, making decisions we can't explain, automating jobs faster than we can create new ones. Genetic engineering that promises to eliminate disease but could also enable designer babies, eugenics 2.0, humans modified to be smarter, stronger, prettier, more obedient. Social media algorithms that learn exactly how to capture attention, exploiting psychological vulnerabilities we didn't know we had, shaping elections, radicalizing millions, making us perform for metrics we don't control. These are the forbidden knowledge of the Watchers, powerful tools we acquired before we developed the wisdom to use them responsibly. There are nation-states and empires that treat entire populations as expendable, that burn the world's carbon budget in decades, that trigger arms races no one can win, that surveil their citizens with tools that would make Orwell weep. Giants stomping across landscapes, crushing whoever gets in their way, justifying atrocity with appeals to national security or historical destiny or the inevitable march of progress. And there are ideologies, political, religious, philosophical, that promise to remake humanity into something better, but require we first devour our neighbors. Communism promised a workers' paradise and delivered gulags. Fascism promised national renewal and delivered genocide. Neoliberal capitalism promised prosperity through deregulation and delivered the largest wealth gap in human history. Every generation produces its own version of the Watcher's promise. We'll give you knowledge, we'll give you power, we'll make you like gods. And every generation learns the same lesson the hard way. Power without wisdom is just violence with better tools. These are our Nephilim. Not literal giants, but metaphorical ones. Entities and systems that operate at scales beyond human comprehension, that consume resources at rates ecosystems can't sustain, that reshape reality to serve their appetites, regardless of who gets crushed in the process. They're too big to control. They're too interconnected to reform. They're too powerful to resist. And like the original Nephilim, they're eating the world. The earth is groaning. That's not poetry. That's measurable fact. Atmospheric carbon at levels not seen in millions of years. Ocean acidification killing coral reefs. Microplastics in every living thing. Topsoil eroding faster than it forms. Aquifers draining faster than they recharge. Forests becoming net carbon emitters instead of sinks. Species extinction rates matching the 5 great mass extinctions. The planet is crying out, just like it did before the flood, and we're the ones making it scream. So here's the question. The Nephilim story forces us to ask, do we need another flood? Not a literal deluge, though climate change is bringing plenty of flooding, but a metaphorical one, a reset, a purge of systems that have become too corrupt to reform, too destructive to sustain, too deeply embedded to dislodge through incremental change. Do we need to drown the giants before they finish devouring creation? History suggests that resets happen whether we want them or not. Civilizations that consume unsustainably eventually hit hard limits. Empires that spread too thin collapse under their own weight. Technologies that outpace wisdom produce catastrophes that force correction. The Bronze Age collapsed, Rome fell. The Industrial Revolution produced conditions so horrific they sparked labor movements and socialist revolutions. Every time the giants get too big, something breaks them. But here's what the Nephilim narrative also teaches us. The flood didn't work. The giants came back. The violence regenerated. The corruption persisted in new forms. Because the problem was never just specific beings or systems. It was the pattern. It was the recurring temptation to reach beyond our grasp, to claim power we're not ready for, to treat the world as something to dominate rather than to dwell within. The genius of the Nephilim story is that it recognizes this. The giants aren't a historical problem we solved. They're an eternal problem we manage. Every generation faces its own version, the empire that grows too proud, the technology that promises too much, the leader who claims he's more than human, the ideology that insists it can perfect humanity if we just give it enough power. And every generation has to make the same choice Noah made. Will we resist the giants, or will we join them? Will we build an ark and preserve what's valuable, or will we participate in the devouring and hope we're not the ones who get eaten? The flood is both judgment and mercy. It destroys the corrupt, but it also preserves a remnant. It's not about perfection. Remember, even Noah got drunk and naked in his tent after the waters receded. It's about survival. It's about maintaining the possibility that something better might emerge after the catastrophe. It's about refusing to let the giants have the final word. So what does resistance look like in the age of modern Nephilim? It looks like living at human scale in a world of giants. It looks like building communities that prioritize sustainability over growth, resilience over efficiency, solidarity over competition, It looks like developing technologies carefully, with humility about unintended consequences, with input from those who will be affected, with kill switches we're willing to use. It looks like resisting the temptation to become giants ourselves, to hoard power, to maximize profit, to treat others as resources to extract. It looks like building arcs, not physical boats. Though given climate change, some of us might need those too. But cultural arcs, intellectual arcs, ecological arcs, preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost, maintaining relationships that capitalism says are inefficient, protecting ecosystems that economics says are worthless, remembering stories like the Nephilim so that when the giants come around again, and they always come around again, we'll recognize them for what they are. The Nephilim narrative is ultimately a story about accountability. The giants thought they were too big to fall. The Watchers thought they were beyond judgment. They were wrong. Creation itself accused them. The ground cried out. And eventually, inevitably, the flood came. Our giants think they're too big to fall too. They think they're beyond accountability, beyond consequences, beyond the limits that constrain everyone else. And maybe for a while they're right. But history has a long memory. Ecosystems have tipping points. And there's always another flood coming, ecological, economic, social, spiritual. The question isn't whether the reckoning arrives. The question is whether there will be anything worth saving when it does. So who were the Nephilim? Were they real beings? Literal giants stalking the ancient world? Hybrid offspring of rebellious angels and human women? Devoured by a flood that cleansed their corruption from the earth? Were they symbols, metaphors for tyrants and empires? For knowledge acquired too soon and power wielded too violently? Were they cultural memories of encounters with rival hominids, with Neanderthals and Denisovans, who walked alongside our ancestors and then vanished, leaving only fragments of DNA and haunted stories? The answer, I think, is yes. Yes, they might have been literal beings, not angels and giants, perhaps, but something real that ancient peoples encountered and feared and destroyed and remembered. Yes, they were definitely symbols, representations of every force that grows too powerful, too proud, too hungry to coexist with fragile humanity. And yes, they're still here, regenerating in every age, taking new forms, but serving the same function. They're the giants who devour the world, the powers that refuse accountability, the appetites that acknowledge no limit. The Nephilim story survives across millennia and cultures because it names something true. Power corrupts, knowledge without wisdom destroys, and whenever beings, human or otherwise, decide they're not bound by the rules that govern everyone else, catastrophe follows. The flood is both warning and pattern. This has happened before. This will happen again. The giants always return. And we always face the same choice. Resist them or join them, build arcs or build monuments to our own greatness. What makes the story profound isn't the answer to whether giants were real, it's the question of what we do about them. Because whatever form they take, physical or metaphorical, ancient or modern, the giants are always with us. They're in our economies, our technologies, our politics, our own ambitions. They're the voice that says take more, grow bigger, dominate harder, ignore the consequences. They're the Watcher's promise. I'll give you knowledge that will make you like gods. And they're the Nephilim's destiny. Consume until there's nothing left to consume, then turn on each other and on ourselves. The heroes of this story aren't the giants. They're not the watchers with their forbidden knowledge. They're not even the archangels who bound them. The heroes are Noah and his family, building an ark when everyone else was feasting with the giants. The heroes are the ones who recognize the corruption, refused to participate, and preserved something worth saving through the catastrophe. That's the challenge the Nephilim story leaves us with. We're living in a world of giants again. Maybe we always have been. The floodwaters are rising, literal and metaphorical. The earth is groaning under the weight of what we've built. And we have to decide, are we building arks, or are we still feasting with the giants, hoping the flood won't come in our lifetime? The Nephilim were the offspring of those who reached beyond their grasp, who crossed boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, who wanted power without wisdom and strength without restraint. They were born from transgression, grew into monsters, and died in the flood that they themselves had made inevitable. The question isn't whether they existed. The question is whether we'll learn from their story before we become them. The giants are still here. The flood is still coming, and the choice, as always, remains ours. Will we be devoured? Will we devour? Or will we build something small enough to float when the waters rise? That's the story of the Nephilim. That's the warning from before the flood. And that's the question that haunts us still, every time we look up at the giants walking among us and realize we built them with our own hands.